Now we are going to critique and demolish the Marxist theory of exploitation, also known as the theory of surplus value. This theory has had some of the most devastating historical consequences in modern times. It has supported or laid the foundation for all of modern socialism, from the most radical or Marxist to the social democracies closer to us. All of the revolutions, all of the conflicts, the millions of deaths, whether in World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War or any other war, all of the social revolutions, the coups, the demagogy of all of the demagogues, whether Fidel Castro, Hugo Chavez, Evo Morales or any other demagogue, the entire modern labor movement, all of these rest explicitly or implicitly on the theory of exploitation. Therefore, it is of vital importance that we be able to analyze it theoretically, using the analytical toolbox we have filled together in this course, in order to determine whether this theoretical foundation is sound or not, and we will see that it is all based on a great scientific falsehood, or to put it more colloquially, a whopping lie. This is a tragedy, because millions of people have died thinking in good faith that they were defending something true and just, when they were defending nothing more than the greatest of injustices, based on the gravest of scientific errors. It is also very frustrating that although this theory was scientifically refuted almost 150 years ago, people are still falling for it and believing it valid today. What does the theory of exploitation say? The theory of exploitation says that all economic goods are the fruit of human labor exclusively, that even so, workers do not receive the entire product of their labor, and that instead, due to a number of odious institutions, specifically private property, employment contracts and so on, workers are exploited by capitalists, who appropriate a large part of this labor in the form of interest, surplus value, entrepreneurial profit, etc. That is what the theory of exploitation says, and that is what millions of people either implicitly or explicitly believe without hesitation. It moves them to go out into the street, to rant, to protest, to vote for supposedly progressive political parties, to maintain labor legislation that dooms millions to unemployment and poverty, to adopt all sorts of demagogic policies, and to condemn countries like Greece to social revolution and poverty. Is exploitation theory valid? We are going to devote our final moments of class to this question, and we will be following Böhm-Bawerk. The tragic thing, as I have just noted, is that although the absolute scientific falsity of this theory has been demonstrated, millions of people even today implicitly or explicitly believe it to be sound, and they believe that it legitimizes political and social movements which, as we have seen, are extremely disruptive. What is the origin of exploitation theory? Well, the origin of exploitation theory can be traced all the way back to the destructive influence of the Protestant Reformation, since, according to that mindset, the future or destiny which awaits a human being in the afterlife does not depend on how that person acts in this life, but is predetermined. His or her only way out is the Calvinist work ethic. Then, the deification of labor in scientific terms as the reason or basis for value is only one step away, and Anglo-Saxon Protestant theorists, beginning with Adam Smith, took that step. In contrast with the contributions of the Spanish scholastics, they formulated a theory of value based on objective criteria. They saw value as something objectively incorporated in things, and as determined basically by the amount of labor involved in their production. Thus, the scientific foundation for the entire theory of exploitation, with all of the tragedies it has led to, lies in the erroneous theory of value developed by the English classical school, and mainly by Adam Smith and his acolytes, among whom David Ricardo is the most important. Though they were self-styled liberals, from a scientific standpoint, they handed on a silver platter to revolutionary socialists the foundation or scientific legitimacy they needed for their revolutionary movements. Later, exploitation theory was developed further by socialist economics or theorists like Sismondi, and figures like Proudhon, Lassalle, and more contemporarily, Karl Marx explored its revolutionary implications. A German thinker named RODBERTUS presented the theory of exploitation in a detailed, analytical manner. He is responsible for formulating it almost completely. In fact, as we will soon see, Marx simply made a few additions or minor clarifications to what RODBERTUS had already articulated. So, what does RODBERTUS'S exploitation theory consist of? For RODBERTUS, the theory of exploitation consists basically of 4 points. First, as I have already mentioned, he considers all economic goods to be the product of human labor exclusively. Second, he states that workers do not receive the entire value of what they produce, something he feels they have an obvious right to receive. Third, RODBERTUS notes that workers are coerced into receiving less than what they produce. They are coerced through a series of odious institutions. He compares these to the institution of slavery, the role of which would presumably be played today by institutions like private property and employment contracts with capitalists and landowners, which permit them to steal, that is the word he uses, a very large portion of the products workers make, and to appropriate these in the form of interest or land rent. Fourth, RODBERTUS states that what he refers to as the exchange value, or the price of a good, is equal to the cost of the labor incorporated in it. That is, the price of the goods, which he calls the exchange value, is equal to the production cost in terms of the labor incorporated in each good. Now we are going to critique RODBERTUS'S exploitation theory. Specifically, we are going to offer 4 criticisms. First, it is false that all economic goods are the product of the labor factor exclusively. Let us consider that. To begin with, for instance, there are natural goods. Every natural good which is useful for achieving an end and is scarce becomes an economic good, even though it incorporates no labor. A diamond in the ground in a Colombian jungle is an immensely valuable economic good, and yet it incorporates no labor besides the effort of squatting down to pick it up. And when someone takes possession of a ruin or a plot of land, all of the natural resources are there, and they have a value many times greater, even though they do not incorporate any labor. Furthermore, dear students, there are numerous goods which incorporate the same amount of labor and yet have radically different values. I am going to give you an example, following the classic example of Böhm-Bawerk. Compare a cask of new Valdepeñas wine with a cask of old Vega Sicilia wine. They incorporate the same number of labor hours to harvest and crush the grapes, so why is one worth 100 times more than the other? Apart from geographical location, it is simply because the process of producing one takes much more time than that of producing the other, though they incorporate the same amount of labor. Therefore, as you can see, RODBERTUS'S starting premise is untenable, since the length of the production period, or the fact that something is or is not a natural resource, quickly refutes the starting premise, namely that all goods are the result of the labor factor exclusively. This brings us to the second essential point of criticism. Now, we must simply remember something we studied here in class, when we covered capital theory, before moving on to the theory of the cycle in my book. Exploitation theorists expect workers to be paid not the entire value of the product of their labor, but substantially more than this amount. If we recognize that every production process takes time, that is, a set of temporal stages, to mature into the final consumer good, and workers contribute their productive effort throughout these stages, one of 2 things can happen. The worker can wait out the entire time period until the consumer good is finished and sold, and then appropriate all of the proceeds. I think in class I gave the example of the production of shoes. We waited a year, and at the end of that time, the pair of shoes was sold for €100. Well, the worker is quite free to become a member of a cooperative or a freelancer and wait out the entire time period, and at the conclusion of the production process, sell the shoes and keep the €100. Alternatively, if he wishes to be paid now for the result of his effort, his month of labor, his contribution to the production process, which will not conclude until 1 year has passed, he will have to be paid the discounted value of his marginal product, his contribution to the production process, but discounted by the interest rate. He cannot be paid €100 today for something that will not be finished until tomorrow, because, as you know, €100 today will be worth 110 a year from now, if the interest rate is 10%. When exploitation theorists argue that the worker must be paid today the entire value of a production process, which will conclude only in the distant future, they are demanding that the worker be paid 110, and not 100, substantially more than what he contributes to the production process. The proof is clear. If the worker wishes, he can become the member of a cooperative, wait out the entire production process, and in a year, when the process matures and the product, the shoes, is sold, he can receive the 100 euros. But he cannot expect to receive 100 euros today, a year earlier. 100 euros a year from now is worth 90 today, because the amount is discounted by the interest rate. So, that difference is not exploitation. It is not something appropriated or stolen from the worker. I repeat, the worker can wait out the process as a freelancer or the member of a cooperative and obtain the proceeds from the sale of the final product when the process concludes. However, if he demands to be paid up front today, he will receive the value discounted by the interest rate. Interest is not something expropriated or taken from the worker, as exploitation theorists claim, because nothing is stopping the worker from joining a cooperative and waiting until the end. The interest rate is simply the social rate of time preference, which, as you know, is a category that exists in the minds of all of us. According to this category, other things being equal, we value present goods more highly than future goods, and thus we are willing to give up the present only if we expect to receive something more in the future. To put it another way, and this is the definitive, devastating criticism, exploitation theorists completely overlook both the fact that production processes take time and the logical category of time preference. That is, other things being equal, present goods are valued more highly than future goods. They are unaware that interest, far from being an odious exploitation of the worker, is simply the social rate of time preference, and that no one is exploited when he is quite free to wait out the production process and obtain all of the proceeds once the process concludes. Still, the vast majority of us do not want to wait until the end of that period. We do not want to take on all of the uncertainties and risks of the production process. We want to be paid our wages at the end of the month, here and now. And as we know, we studied it in class, our wages are determined by our discounted marginal value product. That is, the value of what we contribute to the production process, but discounted by the interest rate. Now we come to the third criticism of exploitation theory. Remember that the value of a good is subjective and has nothing to do with labor. It is almost shameful that I have to repeat this. Value is not part of the makeup of things. It is something the human mind projects onto them. If I think something will help me to achieve an end I value greatly, then I attach value to that thing. Value is subjective. It requires an actor who conceives an action plan that will mature into an end he considers important. And then value is projected, and things become valuable. Imagine I come across a rusty hatchet in a forest. I push the hatchet away with my foot and attach no value to it. And it has no value, because my mind does not project anything onto it. Then imagine a man comes along who is thinking about maybe building a museum. He looks down and says, "Look at that! What luck! I have found a prehistoric hatchet." He picks it up, and it is very valuable. Value is something the mind projects onto things, and the proof is clear. You can spend millions of hours producing something silly. If there is no subjective demand for it, it will have no value in the market. Therefore, value is always subjective, something the mind projects onto things, never objective. Values are not part of the makeup of things. Things do not have an intrinsic value based on the number of hours it takes to produce them. Costs do not determine prices. Instead, and this is the most important lesson of the course, it is the other way around. Market prices, determined by subjective valuations, in turn determine costs. Entrepreneurs are willing to pay the price of the factors of production. That is, they are willing to incur costs because they believe that when the production process matures, they will be able to sell the consumer good in question at a price which permits them to recover the costs incurred, along with an entrepreneurial profit margin. So it is like the donkey that follows the carrot. The carrot, which moves everything, represents market prices, the result of subjective valuations, and the donkey that follows behind represents costs. We could also consider the famous example Roepke gave in his book on economic theory. A hat is worth €100 not because it has cost 90 to produce and the entrepreneur wants to obtain a profit of 10. That is getting it backward. The entrepreneur estimates that she will be able to sell for €100 a hat of a certain style and certain characteristics. So she is willing to incur costs of up to 90 today with the intention of selling the hat for 100 tomorrow and obtaining a profit of 10. Prices determine costs, and not the other way around. This is an essential idea which Luis Saravia de la Calle, the great Spanish scholastic, discovered, and which unfortunately was forgotten due to the harmful influence of the Anglo-Saxon economists of the classical school, starting with Adam Smith. Adam Smith made a clean sweep of the theory of entrepreneurship, the dynamic market process, and attempts to explain the real prices which emerge in the market every day. He focused his research program on trying to explain a phantasmagorical equilibrium price in the long term. And in the long term, and in equilibrium and perfect adjustment, prices and costs mathematically coincide. From that point, he was only one monumental error away from laying the foundations for the belief that costs determine prices, especially in an environment of Calvinistic obsession with labor. For decades, for over a century, this error has led our discipline down the wrong path, and even that would be relatively insignificant if it were not for other repercussions of the error. Indeed, it has provided justification for the theory of exploitation, which has led to the death of many people in wars. They have been the victims of genocides or revolutions carried out by one side or the other. The fourth criticism of RODBERTUS'S exploitation theory is that it is full of contradictions and rests on circular reasoning. If the value of goods is determined by the labor incorporated in them, what determines the value of this labor? Exploitation theorists answer, the value of the goods necessary to reproduce it and to sustain the worker's capacity to work. In other words, it is the value of the worker's food and clothes. Then what determines the value of the worker's food and clothes? The value of the labor it takes to produce them. So, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? We could go back in time in a sort of regression theorem to the very first moment a naked worker picked something up. It already had value, even though there was no labor incorporated in it. The worker projected value onto it in light of his end. RODBERTUS'S theory makes no sense at all. It is rife with contradictions, and it rests on circular reasoning. Furthermore, RODBERTUS reasons as follows. He states that surplus value depends on the labor incorporated in a good. Well, we already know that there are goods which incorporate the same amount of labor, but which yield very different surplus values or quantities of interest. For instance, new wine and old wine incorporate the same amount of labor hours, yet one is worth much more than the other. Why? RODBERTUS is unable to explain it. He is unable to give any satisfactory explanation, as Böhm-Bawerk makes clear. Well, that is all I will say about RODBERTUS'S exploitation theory. Let us move on to Karl Marx's contribution. Listen, the truth is that Karl Marx was a scoundrel. What a shameless rogue he was. He developed his theory of value, interest and exploitation in 3 heavy volumes, which he titled Das Kapital, Capital. The first was published in 1867, prior to the subjectivist revolution of Karl Menger and the Austrian school, which took place 4 years later in 1871. The second volume appeared posthumously in 1885, after the death of Marx, and the third was published in 1894. That is a period of almost 30 years. The Marxist theory of exploitation appears in the first and third volumes. The fact is, Marx realized that he lacked a theory, and that his writings were full of contradictions, and the promise was made to resolve them in the third volume. There was great excitement, especially after Marx's death, regarding what he had written in the third volume. We are going to see what a deep disappointment that volume proved to be for Marx's followers, when they went to read it to find out if the shortcomings which had been identified in the first volume had been remedied. But before we talk about that, I would like to point out Marx's innovations with respect to RODBERTUS. I will mention 7 specifically. Except for these 7 details, Marx's theory is the same as RODBERTUS'S. First, Marx uses a dialectical methodology. This is taken from Hegel, who invented a way of reasoning which is applicable everywhere. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. This dialectical method is applied to explain how history evolves, for instance, or even to explain the linking of syllogisms from the standpoint of philosophy. So, a dialectical methodology is one of Marx's peculiarities, and he takes it from Hegel. Secondly, Marx, who was quite clever, he was certainly no fool, wanted to immunize himself against criticism, and therefore he said he was trying to discover not the value of economic goods, but the value of commodities. And then, as an aside, in small print, do you know how he defines commodities? He defines them as goods produced using labor. How crafty of him! To avoid being criticized and told that many economic goods are not the product of labor, he says, I am going to limit my theory to explaining how the value of commodities is determined, commodities being those goods which are the product of labor. Third, Marx leans on the authority of Aristotle. Well, Aristotle, as brilliant as he was in every area, committed some very grave errors in that of economics. For instance, according to Aristotle, every exchange implies equality, and when 2 things are exchanged, it is because they share a common factor. So Marx leans on him and says, as Aristotle used to say, when 2 things are exchanged, there is a common factor between them. And what is the common factor? It is the amount of labor incorporated in them. Marx could have chosen another common factor, perhaps the weight or the subjective value. But being very clever, he uses labor, because that is more conducive to the social revolution he wishes to scientifically legitimize. Now we come to Marx's 4th particular contribution, which is the idea that capitalists obtain the surplus value, or the amount stolen from workers, by making them work more hours without the corresponding pay. This is important because this peculiarity of Marx, this idea that workers are exploited in this way, you work 3 or 4 hours and we will pay you nothing, largely explains and encourages the entire modern labor movement toward reducing working hours. Union members and workers have the intuition that if people were required to work fewer hours, they would be exploited less, and this intuition comes from Marx. Marx's 5th peculiarity is the theory of polylogism. Marx, in search of a shield against the criticism of others, comes up with the theory of polylogism. Everyone who criticizes me is bourgeois, and thus not imbued with proletarian logic. Now I am immunized against any scientific criticism. What Professor Huerta de Soto is saying now in class is worthless, because he is a bourgeois, and he is not imbued with proletarian logic. 6th, Marx, who is very clever, tells us we must not think about how socialism would work. If Hegelian logic shows that the very unfolding of events will eventually lead to the collapse of capitalism, and socialism will arrive and fall like a ripe apple, why should we think about how socialism will work? Anyone who tries to think about how socialism will work in the future is unscientific, because there is no escaping the triumph of the revolutionary socialist ideal. 7th, Marx specifies that a process of continuous capitalist concentration will bring about this triumph. Companies will consolidate into larger and larger monopolies or trusts, and there will be fewer and fewer multimillionaires, and a growing mass of millions of proletarians, until the forces of social history inevitably give rise to a revolution, and the triumph of the dictatorship of the proletariat and socialist nirvana. Picture that. Well, this has been a brief outline of Marx's peculiarities. Now we will move on to a critique of Marx's exploitation theory. The 4 criticisms we covered earlier against RODBERTUS'S exploitation theory are also applicable to Marx's. However, in addition to those 4, which are crushing and definitive, we must also mention the following 6. First, it is false that every exchange implies equality. Quite the opposite is true, as we have already seen in class. Exchanges emerge as the result of an inequality in subjective valuations. Each party always subjectively values more highly what she lacks and the other party has than what she has, and expects to give in exchange. Only when there is an inequality in subjective valuations does an exchange occur. Otherwise there is none. Look at my arms. If I have the same strength in the right arm as in the left, there is no movement, no change. When an exchange takes place, it is because there is an inequality, and both parties come out ahead as a result of the deal. Aristotle made a very serious error, and Marx self-interestedly cited it as an argument from authority. Second, as I have already pointed out, Marx was very sly. In order to explain the value of goods, he limits himself to those which are the product of the labor factor, and which he calls commodities, and he leaves out those which do not interest him and do not fit in with his analysis, like natural goods. Third, it is also scientifically false that there is a common factor in exchanges, and that it must consist precisely of the labor incorporated in goods. Marx pulls that out of a hat. He is a juggler. With the reasoning he employs, he could have chosen any other supposed common factor. Why labor? Well, labor is more favorable to his predetermined conclusion. As Böhm-Bawerk indicates, he could have chosen rarity, scarcity, or weight as a common factor. But Marx has a preconceived idea of the conclusion he wants to reach in order to provide a veneer of scientific respectability for a political revolutionary movement. Therefore, he skews the analysis toward what interests him. In short, he is an intellectual fraudster. Fourth, polylogism is false. The human mind has the same logical structure regardless of the race, skin color, creed, height, or religion of the person in question. The logical structure is the same because a different structure is inconceivable. There is the category of yes and the category of no. Furthermore, it seems the bourgeois Karl Marx, son of a bourgeois family, specialist in making the servant girls pregnant, was in some mysterious way imbued with proletarian culture, and that is not to mention his powerful patron, the #1 Marxist Friedrich Engels. Do you know what the profession of Engels was? He owned textile factories, the quintessence of exploitation during the Industrial Revolution. But Engels was imbued with proletarian consciousness. The theory of polylogism is simply a crude falsehood Marx devised with the intention of immunizing himself against scientific criticism. What is more, polylogism leads to nothing but shots in the back of the head. One cannot argue, you are a bourgeois, I am a proletarian, I must destroy you. Then everything is justified. The act of shooting 20,000 Polish soldiers, officers and bourgeois in Katyn was justified. Our hands should not shake, nor should we have any moral qualms, since those are people of another race, or another social class, or another creed. That is the maximum immorality, clothed in scientific respectability. Fifth, we come full circle with the criticisms Mises offers. Why should we not be able to think scientifically about how socialism will work? Do not be an intellectual fraudster, Mr. Marx. Socialism cannot work, because it is impossible to organize society from above based on coercive commands, since the planning agency cannot acquire the information it would need to give a coordinating quality to these commands. Also, your prediction of a process of capitalist concentration is false. The notion that companies are going to merge into larger and larger monopolies. There is a limit to the possibility of creating larger and larger companies, and economic calculation is precisely what determines that limit. If all companies integrate vertically, and the information contained in market prices is lost, the administrators of that enormous company can no longer manage it. It becomes like a small state, and is no match for a constellation of small and medium-sized enterprises that are competing in the market and setting prices. There is a limit. There is a market law which puts a maximum limit on corporate concentration. So, that process of capitalist concentration, which from the Marxist and Hegelian viewpoint is inevitable, does not take place. Well, Mises leveled these more or less thorough criticisms at Marx's first volume, and all of his disciples were stunned. Marx promised that in the third volume he would give a response. But, cunning as usual, he died before he ever faced the music. Nevertheless, he did write the third volume before his death, and Engels later published it. All of Marx's disciples ran to read it to find out what the promised response would be. And do you know what the response consisted of? It was a bitter disappointment. Marx admits that goods are not exchanged in the market based on the labor incorporated in them, which is obvious. However, and this is the sixth criticism, he fails to recognize that a contradiction exists and that his theory falls flat. In fact, he states that the deviations we observe in the real world cancel each other out, and he remains perfectly unruffled. What Marx is saying is, I admit that my entire theory is shoddy, that goods are not exchanged in the market as I describe, and that the cost of labor does not determine the value of things. But the differences in one direction compensate for the differences in the other direction. We might just as well say exchanges are based on weight. What? It is nonsense to say exchanges in the market are based on weight. An ounce of gold for 50,000 ounces of iron is more like it. Well, you see, a difference above is compensated for by a difference below in another exchange. In short, with that argument, I could justify whatever I pleased as the basis of value, weight, labor, or anything else. By Marx's thinking, any basis of value, no matter how absurd, would be valid, since the differences in one direction would compensate for the differences in the other direction in aggregate terms. What conclusion can we draw about Marxist theory and about exploitation theory in general? In the end, it is a radically and scientifically false theory. But the worst of it is the discovery that its cultivators, and particularly Marxists, display an absolute lack of scientific honesty. As I mentioned before, they have a preconceived idea. They know the results they want, and for what purpose? To foster a social revolution, even though they know the science is false. We can affirm without any doubt that Marxism is the greatest intellectual fraud in the history of human thought. It really is an intellectual fraud, and that is not a trivial matter. We are not talking about being swindled out of money. We are talking about millions of people having died unjustly. They have been shot in the back of the head. They have died in concentration camps. They have been victims of genocide. All of these deaths have occurred due to intellectual errors. It is the mission of the university to expose such errors, and it is your responsibility. No one can shirk it. You will be held accountable one day if you do. You must be responsible people. You must study, analyze, and have sound arguments. And whenever you hear the slightest Marxist or socialist argument, you must immediately spring into action and demolish your opponent's argument intellectually. Always intellectually. That is your mission and your responsibility. I give teaching these classes everything I've got. I am passing the torch on to you, and now it is your responsibility to keep studying, to enrich what you have learned, to continue researching, and later to hand on to the next generation the knowledge you have gained. To fail to take on this task is to risk the disappearance of civilization due to intellectual frauds. It is here, at universities and centers of thought, that the greatest genocides are conceived, and the greatest advancements in civilization are fostered. Ideas invariably lie at their root, and ideas are studied, cultivated, and advanced at universities. Sombart, another famous socialist, admits Marx's theory is false, but sees it as a way to interpret reality and praises its political ramifications. Listen, to make a correct interpretation of reality, one must hold a valid theory. So you are another fraudster. You do not care whether the theory is coherent or not. Your objective is political. You want to shoot your opponents in the back of the head, seize power yourself, and impose your idea, your law on society. Bernstein says something similar. He says, the theory is false, but it is a fact that people are being exploited in real life. What do you mean? It is a fact that people are being exploited in real life. You are an exploiter and a demagogue, and you are deceiving people, particularly the poor, those who find themselves in the least favorable social position, and who can more easily become victims of deception and demagogy. Well, if the theory is false, why has it had so many supporters, and why does it continue to have them? The answer, dear students, is that in general, we human beings have a very peculiar, a very curious nature. People believe what they want to believe. They speak and think more with their hearts than with their heads. As you know, if we were to take a vote, who is in favor of having our salaries and our vacation time doubled, every hand would go up. No one bothers to think. And if Papa State can offer us a guarantee, so much the better. And why not give us free education, and transportation, and textbooks? We should receive everything for free, and our salaries should be doubled or tripled. And why only tripled? And why should we retire at 67 or at 65? Why not at 60? In fact, why should we have to work at all? No more working. Let Papa State take care of everything. The dictatorship of the proletariat, the nirvana of socialist paradise. Also, I would like to offer a mea culpa in the name of my fellow economists. It is a disgrace that at Spanish universities, a critique of exploitation theory is not obligatory in the study programs of all economics disciplines. Only in this program at this university is the theory of exploitation demolished. Why? Because there is an implicit law of silence, because universities are public, and because it is not considered politically correct to attack the foundations of the modern labor movement. Nevertheless, it is the mission of universities to demonstrate transparency and to unmask intellectual fraudsters.